Factors driving demand. For most of us, economics amounts to a balance between what we want and what we can afford. Because of this dilemma, each person must choose how much money to save and how much money to spend. Demand is driven by a number of factors that influence how people decide to spend their money, including price. It can be driven by consumers' preferences. It may also be driven by outside circumstances or larger economic events, such as recessions in the economy. Demand can also increase the availability of certain types of goods and services. In general, as the price of a good or service goes up, people buy smaller amounts. In other words, as price rises, the quantity demanded declines. At lower prices, consumers are generally willing to buy more of a good. So what I have represented here is what is known as a demand curve. It's a graphic representation of the amount of product that buyers will purchase at different prices. Demand curves typically slope downward, meaning that the lower the prices attract larger and larger purchases. So if we look at our demand curve here, realizing it's a straight line, we can see, we look at this, is that if we were up here at P5, that the consumer is less likely to buy that good or that service. On the other hand, though, if we see that the price is really falling, then we would notice that, we would notice, let me paste this in here, we would notice that the price falls and the quantity that somebody is willing to buy at, amount-wise increases. This is known as demand. On the other side, we have supply. Important economic factors also affect supply. The willingness and ability of firms to provide goods and services at different prices. Just as consumers must decide about how to spend their money, businesses must decide what products to sell and how they're going to sell them. So the important thing to remember is that demand is really directed by the consumer, and that supply is really directed by the maker, if you will. So, you hear supply side economics, basically build it, and they will come and it will trickle down through the economy. Sellers would prefer to charge higher prices for their products, just as buyers would like to buy them for cheaper. A supply curve shows the relationship between different prices and the quantities that sellers will offer for sale, regardless of demand. Movement along the supply curve is the opposite of movement along the demand curve. So as prices rise, the quantity the sellers are willing to supply also rises. So we see in our chart here, obviously, we used our same model. Notice that the demand curve goes from the bottom to the top is the opposite, or excuse me, the supply curve goes from the bottom to the top, just opposite of what our demand curve did. If I was only making Q1 down here, I wouldn't have much of an incentive to purchase or to supply the consumer with anything. What's the point? I'm getting very little. Whereas if I had the ability to produce more quantity, I would be willing to oh, there I go again, to produce a lot more and therefore make a lot more money. Okay, so that is the difference between supply and demand. I want to introduce one more concept here, and it's called equilibrium, sometimes referred to as market equilibrium. We look at these things, supply and demand, in a vacuum, but there are a lot of forces that come into play: the economic cycle, just a variety of customer preferences, substitute goods that come into play for both the consumer and the producer. But in reality, what happens with products and services is they eventually come into what we call equilibrium. What people are willing to pay and what it costs to produce will eventually come into what we call as market equilibrium, which is the point in which these things intersect, which for us is right there. This would be our market equilibrium. So remember that demand is on the consumer side. The less something costs, the more the buyer's willing to pay for it. Supply is on the producer side. The more they can make, the more they're willing to produce. But at the end of the day, it's market equilibrium that will come into play. And that's essentially why we get what, it's what the market will bear. Well, that's equilibrium in a nutshell. I hope this has helped you have a better understanding of demand and supply.